The Nazis thought they'd escaped. But what if I told you they found refuge in the jungles of South America, building new empires in secret? Welcome to Forgotten History Tales, where the past hides darker secrets than we could ever imagine. Let me take you inside. The air was thick with the smell of burning wood. Not far from the roar of the artillery, a strange quiet had settled over the heart of Berlin in those last days of the war. The streets that had once been lined with grand buildings now lay in ruin. Rubble, smoke, and the echoes of dying hopes. The Allies were closing in from every side, and the Third Reich was collapsing like a house of cards. I take you into the heart of this chaos, into the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, where the man who had once been the most feared leader in the world now sat, trapped by his own ambition. Hitler, the architect of a nightmare that had consumed an entire continent, was now a prisoner of his own making. It was in these final moments, as the world turned against him, that the true scale of the escape routes, the secret Nazi exit strategies, began to take shape. I feel the weight of the history that surrounds me. The clinking of glass bottles, the shuffle of boots across the concrete floors, the anxious whispers of officers planning their own futures. In this dark, crumbling maze of corridors, every man had his own secret. They knew what was coming, the inevitable end. But not all would face it. Not all would meet their end in the ruins of Berlin. Some would escape. They had been preparing for this moment for years, long before the Allies breached the walls of Berlin, long before the Soviet flag flew over the Reichstag. Even as the war raged on, a shadowy network of safe houses, hidden ships, and secretive escape routes had been established, reaching out to the farthest corners of the earth. And as the Third Reich crumbled, these escape routes, so carefully crafted, became the lifelines for many of Hitler's inner circle. I want you to imagine the tension in the final days of the war, the faint smell of sweat and fear in the bunker as officers, soldiers, and Nazi officials turned to face their inevitable fate, the explosions that shook the ground above, the sound of sirens blaring as the Soviets advanced. But even as the walls of the Third Reich began to fall, plans were already in motion, plans for escape, for survival, for a twisted kind of rebirth. It was not just the fear of capture that drove the escape routes. It was the fear of retribution, of the horrors that awaited these men and women who had helped build the Nazi regime, those who had participated in the atrocities of the Holocaust, the brutal conquests across Europe, the destruction of entire cities. They knew that justice, once the Allies took control, would not be kind. Many of them had blood on their hands, blood that would follow them even across oceans. I take you now to Argentina, a country that would become the cradle of the Nazi fugitives, to the city of Buenos Aires, where the first of many secretive flights would carry men of power and influence into South America's welcoming arms. The Argentine government, under Juan Perón, had made it clear that they would protect these war criminals in exchange for the technology and knowledge they brought with them. The early days of the escape routes were chaotic. The first high-profile Nazi to flee was none other than Adolf Eichmann, the architect of the Holocaust. As he boarded his flight, his eyes must have been full of dread, but also a grim sense of triumph. He knew he was escaping not just from the Allies, but from the justice that had begun to reach him in Europe. But Eichmann was just the beginning. Over the next few years, a steady stream of Nazis would make their way to South America, men who had once been in positions of unimaginable power, responsible for crimes that had shattered the lives of millions. Some would find refuge in Argentina, while others would make their way to Brazil, Paraguay, and even Chile. In these countries, their pasts were not only hidden, they were buried, safeguarded by corrupt officials, sympathetic political figures, and secretive networks. I can almost hear the sound of the old planes as they made their way across the Atlantic, their engines humming in the darkness of the night sky. The passengers, many of whom had been prominent figures in the Nazi regime, sat in grim silence. They knew that their future was no longer about the ideals of the Reich, but about survival. They were fleeing not just for their lives, but for a chance to begin again, far away from the destruction and ruin they had left behind. The escape routes were far from simple. They were networks of betrayal and deception, crossing oceans, traversing jungles, and passing through borders with forged documents and false identities. And the escape itself wasn't just a matter of survival. It was about the power they could retain even in exile, the knowledge they possessed about weapons, technologies, and military strategies was invaluable. South America would become the new breeding ground for a fascist ideology that had nearly brought the world to its knees. I hear the whispers now, echoes of a different time, about the men who made these escapes possible, men who were willing to risk everything for a cause that had already failed. They had no choice but to flee, for to remain would be to face the wrath of a world that would never forget. But in their flight, they found new opportunities, new ways to wield power from the shadows. In the coming sections, I will take you deeper into the world of these Nazi escape routes, into the heart of South America, where the past never truly died. The places where these men found sanctuary, the mysterious figures who helped them, and the chilling legacy they left behind. But for now, let us pause, for the journey ahead will take us to hidden corners of history that remain shrouded in secrecy. We will uncover stories of escape, of treachery, and of the twisted rebirth of the Nazis in a land far from their fallen empire. The next chapter awaits, and with it, the dark tale of how they began to rebuild their lives and their sinister dreams in the jungles of South America. The next development without abrupt shifts. Follow these guidelines. Section 2. Keep the narrative tightly connected to the previous section, as if the story never stopped. Ensure the timeline remains strong and coherent. No unnecessary jumps or diversions. The tone, pacing, and style must match the established cinematic first-person flow. Maintain suspense and intrigue while naturally guiding the story toward the next key moment. Avoid headlines or section breaks. The story should feel continuous and immersive. End with a haunting or suspenseful line that sets up the next part. The escape routes were not the product of chance. They were the result of meticulous planning, a silent collaboration between men who had once stood at the pinnacle of power. And now, as the last remnants of the Third Reich crumbled beneath the weight of its own hubris, these men began their exodus into a new world. They didn't run to hide. They ran to preserve what they had lost. The ideals of the Reich, twisted as they were, still held sway in their hearts, even in exile. The journey from Berlin to Buenos Aires was no simple task. For some, it was a matter of weeks, for others, months. The Nazis were experts in deception, in camouflage, and in manipulation. But even their careful planning was not enough to erase the sense of danger that clung to them. They were fugitives now, hunted men, haunted by the specter of the atrocities they had committed. The shadows of the Holocaust followed them across the ocean, even if their pursuers were too far behind to catch them. Yet, in South America, in those far-flung corners of the continent, they found something that many of them had longed for: a fresh start. But that fresh start came at a cost. In the sprawling city of Buenos Aires, among the slums and bustling streets, the Nazis found a strange new sense of freedom, freedom to move, to plot, to scheme once more. They were not welcomed with open arms. They were tolerated, allowed to live quietly, to settle into their new lives. The Argentine government, under the sway of Perón, was complicit in their arrival. They had their own reasons, political, economic, and strategic, for protecting these war criminals, for offering them shelter. The Nazis, in turn, offered something equally valuable: technology, knowledge, and access to the secrets of a war they had nearly won. I can still see them, these men who had once controlled the fate of millions, now reduced to living in the shadows. Their new identities were carefully forged, their faces altered, their histories rewritten. It was as if they had disappeared from the pages of history, but in truth, they had simply been erased and reborn under a new name. The man who would become known as Joseph Mengele, the infamous Angel of Death, was among the first to settle in the region. His escape was one of the most audacious, a reflection of the ruthlessness that had marked his time in Auschwitz. But in South America, far from the prying eyes of Europe, he could continue his research, his horrific experiments, now unimpeded by the horrors of war. His work, now far from the public eye, would leave an indelible mark on the continent's dark history. The world might not know his name, but the people who lived in the shadows of Argentina would. The question that haunted me, as I dug deeper into this web of deception and escape, was simple. Why South America? Why were these men, these architects of evil, allowed to flourish in this strange new land? The answer lies in the continent's history. In the years following the war, South America was a continent of chaos. Political instability ran rampant, with military juntas and corrupt governments rising to power, often with little regard for the rule of law. In this tumultuous environment, the Nazis found fertile ground. They forged alliances with those in power, ingrained themselves into the fabric of society, and used their connections to carve out a niche for themselves. And as the world focused on rebuilding Europe, on punishing the men who had destroyed it, South America became a safe haven for those who had once been untouchable. But it wasn't just the Nazi war criminals themselves who found refuge. They brought with them a cadre of supporters, scientists, engineers, military experts, all eager to continue the work of their former masters. The very technologies that had helped fuel the Nazi war machine would be passed on to new governments, new leaders, who would use them for their own agendas. The story of the Nazis in South America wasn't just one of escape. It was one of influence, of rebuilding, of plotting for a future that would be built upon the ashes of the Third Reich. As the years passed, some of these men would find themselves drawn into the burgeoning Cold War. The world had divided into two factions, and the Nazi fugitives, with their knowledge of weapons, technology, and military strategy, became valuable assets in the fight between East and West. The U.S. government, in particular, turned a blind eye to their past, recognizing the potential value these men could bring in the struggle against the Soviet Union. Some of the very same scientists who had built the rockets that helped Hitler launch his war now worked for the Americans in what would become known as Operation Paperclip. But these same men, hidden in the shadows of South America, remained loyal to their own cause, even as they made deals with the powers of the world that had destroyed their empire. In Buenos Aires, the streets were alive with the energy of this new era. The city, with its vibrant culture and its mix of old-world European influence, had become a haven for Nazis and their supporters. The atmosphere was thick with intrigue. Each encounter, each meeting carried the weight of the past. It was a city of secrets, where whispers in the night could change the course of history. As I walk through those same streets today, I can feel the ghosts of the past, the echoes of Nazi officers speaking in hushed tones in darkened corners, the scent of cigars mingling with the sharp smell of fear, the taste of tension in the air. They were here, hiding in plain sight, living lives that would never again be touched by the light of justice. But their story didn't end here. The escape routes didn't vanish with the end of the war. They stretched on, hidden deep within the heart of South America, where men like Mengele and Eichmann would live in quiet exile for years, their actions untouched by the outside world. Some would live long lives, escaping the justice they so richly deserved. Others would be caught, eventually. As I bring you closer to the heart of their story, we will follow their journey, tracing their steps through the mountains, across the jungles, and into the waiting arms of those who sought to protect them. But not all of them would escape the reach of the truth. For now, though, let me leave you with this. In the shadows of South America, as the world turned its back, the Nazis weren't just hiding, they were plotting, and the legacy of their escape. I take you now deeper into the heart of the South American labyrinth, where these men, once rulers of the world, navigated the strange new geography of their exile. The jungle-covered mountains of Paraguay, the dense forests of Brazil, the remote towns of Chile. These places would become the final chapters in the life stories of some of the most infamous Nazis to survive the fall of the Third Reich. As we travel through these forgotten corners of the world, we must remember that these escape routes were not just about flight. They were about survival, and the twisted sense of rebirth these men felt as they reasserted their power, even in defeat. The stories of the escapees were as varied as the countries they fled to. Some sought nothing more than to blend in, to disappear into the anonymity of a foreign land. Others, like the notorious Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, embraced the opportunity to rise again, forging new alliances with local leaders, even manipulating the chaos of post-war South America for their own gain. The journey was long, but the rewards were far greater than the risks. The escape route stretched across the map like a spider's web, each path leading to a different sanctuary, each crossing bringing them closer to a twisted kind of victory. From Europe to South America, the passage was clandestine and dangerous, but the promises of power, influence, and a new life were enough to make the leap worth the gamble. In Paraguay, a small country with a history of military dictatorship and political instability, the Nazis found fertile ground. The country's leader, Alfredo Stroessner, had his own ambitions, ones that mirrored the fascist ideology of the men who had escaped to his shores. Stroessner was eager to consolidate his power, and he found that the expertise of Nazi engineers, scientists, and military officials could help him build his vision of a strong, authoritarian state. It was a match made in darkness, and in this unlikely alliance, the remnants of the Nazi regime found a place to thrive. I can feel the weight of their lives here, those men who had been part of the machinery of destruction. The jungle surrounding them seemed to swallow their sins, hiding them from the prying eyes of the world. Their once glorious uniforms now replaced by civilian clothes, they moved quietly among the people, blending in, but never truly forgotten. In the villages and towns, they were just another face in the crowd, but in the corridors of power, they were a different breed, still driven by the same delusional ideologies that had caused the death of millions. Take Klaus Barbie, for example. His arrival in Bolivia was a calculated one. It was no accident that he found refuge in a country so steeped in its own political turbulence. Barbie, whose hands were stained with the blood of countless innocents, found solace in the protection of the Bolivian government. He didn't just escape, he ingratiated himself with the local military, securing a position of influence. The horrors he had committed in France, the deportation of Jewish families, the torture of resistance fighters, seemed distant now, far removed from the quiet life he led in Bolivia. But just beneath the surface, his criminal past remained alive, and soon enough, the international community would begin to uncover the truth. I feel the tension that must have hung in the air when Barbie walked through the dusty streets of La Paz, where no one suspected the monster in their midst. The scent of coal fires, the cries of street vendors, the laughter of children, it all must have felt so ordinary to the people of the town, but beneath the layers of everyday life, the past never truly disappeared. Barbie, like so many others, carried the weight of his actions, and it was only a matter of time before his name would surface again. But not all Nazis in South America sought to continue their evil in the open. Some, like the infamous Josef Mengele, the Angel of Death, hid their identities more carefully. Mengele had been one of the most notorious figures of the Holocaust, performing unspeakable experiments on prisoners at Auschwitz. After escaping Germany, he too found solace in Argentina, where he spent the rest of his days trying to blend in with the local population. I can almost feel Mengele's unease as he stepped off that plane in Buenos Aires, an unsettled man, unrecognizable to those around him, yet still driven by the same twisted ideals that had made him infamous. Argentina, under the regime of Perón, was a country that allowed these fugitives to slip into the shadows. Mengele knew the risk of being discovered, but in South America, where anonymity was easily obtained, he felt safe. And yet, even as he lived his life under a false identity, there was a sense of unreality about his existence. The world he had known, the power, the influence, the ability to destroy lives without consequence, was gone. But his legacy, the horrors he had left behind, would never let him truly escape. Even in exile, the Nazis weren't done. They weren't simply running from the past. They were also planning for a future that would be built on their warped ideals. In the remote jungles of Paraguay, in the isolated communities of Argentina, the Third Reich didn't die. It simply evolved into something darker, more insidious. They were still ideologically driven, still clinging to the notion that their cause was just, and they sought ways to spread that vision through these new nations. They recruited local sympathizers, trained new forces, and quietly shaped the politics of the countries that had taken them in. But as the years passed, so did the inevitability of justice. Some of the Nazis who had once been untouchable would begin to feel the long arm of the law. Mengele, who had evaded capture for decades, would live in fear until the end of his days. And Klaus Barbie, whose ties to the Bolivian government had protected him for years, would eventually be caught and brought to trial, his dark legacy exposed for the world to see. For some, the shadow of the past would never fade. For others, it would be a matter of time before the truth would come to light. In the end, their secrets could only stay buried for so long. The question that lingered in the air as I walked through the crumbling remnants of their world was simple. How far would the legacy of the Nazis stretch? How many would they bring into their dark fold before the truth could catch up with them? As we move forward, the story of these men doesn't end here. It continues in the shadows of history, in the tangled webs of deceit that stretch from South America to Europe, And in those shadows, the final chapters of their escape are still being written. I take you now further into the murky waters of history, where the shadows of the past still stretch long over the lives of the Nazi fugitives who fled to South America. The years following their arrival were not ones of quiet retreat, but rather a twisted resurgence of old ideals, ones that, despite the fall of the Third Reich, were very much alive in the hearts of those who had once carried the flag of fascism. The escape routes, the secret alliances, the carefully constructed lives they built for themselves were not merely about survival. They were about power, influence, and in many cases, the continuation of their ideological mission. By now, some of these men had become legends in their own right, mythic figures who had managed to slip through the cracks of history, their dark deeds shrouded in the fog of time. They were no longer just fugitives. They had become something far more dangerous, masters of a silent war that was waged not with guns, but with influence, manipulation, and secrecy. The echoes of this silent war reached far beyond the jungles of Paraguay or the boulevards of Buenos Aires. As the Cold War divided the world, the Nazis in South America found themselves in an unusual position. On the one hand, they were still hunted men, fugitive criminals who were not entirely free from the specter of justice. But on the other hand, they were also valuable assets in the eyes of the global superpowers. The United States, embroiled in its own battle against the Soviet Union, saw the knowledge and expertise these men possessed as crucial to winning the Cold War. In Operation Paperclip, the U.S. had already brought over hundreds of Nazi scientists and engineers, integrating them into their own military and technological programs. But what many didn't know, what was buried in the shadows, was that the Nazis were also cultivating their own network of influence in South America. They weren't just running away from Europe. They were finding new opportunities to work with those who saw in them not criminals, but valuable assets. In countries like Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay, Nazi officers were not just hiding. They were working in secret to bolster authoritarian regimes that mirrored their own vision of power. Their connections, forged through years of navigating the treacherous politics of Europe, now helped them to manipulate the governments of South America. They weren't simply content with living in exile. They were shaping the future of the continent. And this influence, built in secrecy, would have far-reaching consequences for decades to come. I can feel the weight of this realization pressing down on me as I continue to trace their steps across the continent. These men, who had once held the reins of power over Europe, were now quietly exerting their will in far-flung corners of the world. The question was no longer about their survival. It was about what they were building in the shadows, what dangerous alliances they were forming, and what kind of world they hoped to create. The jungles of Paraguay were a key site in this new phase of the Nazi legacy. Here, in the remote forests, they found refuge, but more importantly, they found a place to continue their work. The proximity to the Brazilian border was crucial, as it allowed for smuggling routes that stretched across multiple countries, creating a clandestine network of like-minded individuals who saw the old fascist ideology not as a relic of the past, but as a living, breathing force capable of shaping the future. In Paraguay, the Nazis established a small community, one that would become a sanctuary for those still loyal to the ideals of the Reich. This community, while small in number, was significant in its influence. The men who gathered here weren't just hiding from the world. They were plotting, they were recruiting, and they were planning for a future that would see their ideals rise again. The quiet streets of Asunción, the capital of Paraguay, became a backdrop for the strange meetings that took place in the shadows. I can almost hear the low murmurs of conversation in a private villa, where Nazi war criminals met with local officials, sharing their knowledge of military strategy, weaponry, and technologies that had once been the domain of the most powerful empire in history. The deals they struck would echo through the corridors of time, creating a web of influence that would entangle not only South America, but the rest of the world. I think of the young men and women who came to these secret meetings, eager to hear the twisted rhetoric that these Nazis had to offer. They didn't know the full extent of what these men had done. They only saw the power, the strength, and the promise of a new world order. They were the first recruits to a new kind of fascism, one that wasn't tied to any single country, but instead spread across borders, finding fertile ground in the unstable political climate of South America. And then there was Mengele, the infamous doctor whose name was synonymous with the horrors of Auschwitz. He too found a strange kind of sanctuary in South America, but not just in Argentina. Mengele moved between countries, finding comfort in places where his reputation was either unknown or conveniently overlooked. His experiments had never truly stopped. They had only changed form. While the world turned its back on the atrocities of the past, Mengele continued his research, far from the reach of justice. The jungle, with its isolation, became a perfect hiding place for a man who had long since shed any remnants of humanity. There is a chill in the air as I walk through the narrow streets of the small town in northern Argentina, where Mengele once hid. The sun sets low, casting long shadows across the town square, and I can almost feel his presence in the quiet spaces. He wasn't alone, of course. Many others had come to these remote corners of the world, seeking to continue the work that had started in Europe. But Mengele, in his twisted mind, saw himself as a pioneer, a man who could push the boundaries of science and ethics in ways that the world would never allow. And in South America, he found the freedom to continue his experiments. The myths surrounding Mengele have long since become as tangled as the jungle itself. Some say he lived out his days in Paraguay, hidden away in a small community of sympathizers. Others claim that he managed to evade justice until his death, living quietly under the protection of local officials. His legacy, like that of so many others, would become a part of the dark fabric of South America's history. A reminder that sometimes even the most monstrous men can live on, long after the world believes they have been defeated. As I stand in the midst of this history, I realize that the story is far from over. The Nazis' escape to South America was not an end, but a twisted new beginning, one that continues to haunt the continent to this day. The legacy of their actions is etched into the land itself, a reminder of how easily power can be shifted, how quickly ideology can be resurrected. And in this haunting quiet, I leave you with a thought. The Nazi escape routes didn't just lead to a new life, they led to a dangerous rebirth. A silent war fought not with weapons, but with ideas, influence, and power. It was a war that, even today, continues to shape the shadows of South America. The story is not yet finished. The years stretched on, and as I continue my journey through the heart of South America, the haunting presence of the Nazi fugitives becomes more palpable, more real. Their escape was not just a flight from Europe. It was a careful, calculated relocation of power into new hands. The continent had become a new battlefield, one where the stakes were as high as the dreams of the men who had once held the fate of an entire world in their grasp. I walk through the narrow, dusty streets of Buenos Aires, the city that became home to so many of these men, and feel the weight of their presence in every corner. The crumbling architecture, the smoke rising from street vendors, the faint hum of traffic, everything about this place seems so ordinary, so alive. And yet, beneath the surface, the truth of what happened here is buried in the shadows, just out of sight. Buenos Aires wasn't just a refuge, it was a launch pad. The Nazis who found sanctuary here weren't just content to hide. They were determined to use this new land, this new life, as a base for continuing their work. They were, after all, masters of manipulation, of control, and they saw in South America not a land of refuge, but a place to continue their twisted dreams. Their influence spread into the politics of the region through bribery, coercion, and secret dealings. They didn't just survive, they flourished, quietly and without mercy. In Argentina, the network of ex-Nazis wasn't just hidden in the shadows of villas and private estates. It stretched deep into the government itself. Juan Perón, the Argentine president, welcomed many of the Nazis with open arms, seeing them as valuable resources in his own bid to consolidate power. Perón was no stranger to authoritarianism. His sympathies with fascist ideologies were well known, and the presence of high-ranking Nazi officials in his country helped bolster his regime. I can feel the unease that must have pervaded the corridors of power during those years. These men, these former officers, scientists, and war criminals, weren't just ordinary refugees. They were experts in war, in technology, in manipulation, and they brought, with them, the knowledge of a world that was both dead and alive in their memories. They were not merely looking to escape justice. They were building something new, something dangerous, under the very noses of the world. And in Argentina, under Perón's protection, they found a place where their dreams could flourish. The Nazis who had escaped to South America weren't all the same. Some were content with obscurity, living under false names, hidden from the world. But others were more ambitious. They wanted power. They wanted to shape a world that mirrored the Reich they had lost. And for them, Argentina, with its political instability, its weak government, and its rising military junta, was the perfect place to make their mark. I take you now to the heart of the secretive network that flourished in these dark years. The town of San Miguel, a sleepy Argentine village tucked away in the rolling hills, became a gathering point for Nazi sympathizers and former officers alike. It was here, in the quiet stillness of the countryside, that deals were struck, plans were made, and the legacy of the Third Reich continued to grow, albeit in the shadows. This was a place where former SS officers, who had once been among the most feared men in Europe, could sit quietly with local military leaders and discuss their plans for the future, plans that would never see the light of day, but would leave their mark nonetheless. I stand in the square of San Miguel now, the sun beating down on the cobbled streets. The buildings are old, weathered by time, but there's an unsettling stillness in the air. It's as though the town itself is holding its breath, remembering something it can't quite forget. It was here, in these quiet streets, that men like Josef Mengele, who had fled from the horrors of Auschwitz, found a place to live, to disappear, to continue their work. And it was here, in this small, forgotten town, that the seeds of a dangerous, twisted future were planted, hidden beneath layers of politics and corruption, where the world couldn't see. It wasn't just the Nazis who made their home in South America. They brought with them an army of followers, sympathizers, criminals, and those too blinded by their own ambitions to understand the true horrors of what they were supporting. Many of these people became embedded in the local communities, influencing local politics, becoming part of the military, the police, the government. They weren't just hiding, they were quietly rebuilding. The complexity of these secret networks cannot be overstated. The Nazis who came to South America didn't simply blend in, they built their own underground empires. They infiltrated the military, the police, even local businesses, and slowly but surely, they created a web of influence that reached across the continent. Through their connections, through their networks, they began to manipulate not only the governments of South America, but also the global superpowers. They weren't just hidden away in the jungles or mountains. They were actively shaping the policies of the countries that had given them refuge. It was during this period of rebuilding that the legacy of the Nazis truly began to take shape. The men who had once been part of a failed empire now had a new opportunity to fulfill their twisted vision. They didn't just want to escape their pasts, they wanted to reshape the future. And South America, with its political instability and its shifting alliances, was the perfect place to do it. But even as they were building their new lives, the walls were slowly closing in. The world wasn't blind to their presence forever. As the years passed, the Nazi war criminals who had fled to South America would find themselves facing the inevitable consequences of their actions. The question was no longer whether they would be found. It was when. And for many, that reckoning would come too late. As I leave the quiet streets of San Miguel, I feel the weight of the history that still clings to this place. The past, buried beneath layers of time and secrecy, has a way of surfacing when least expected. And though the Nazis who fled to South America thought they could outrun justice, history has a way of catching up, one way or another. But their legacy, even in death, is far from over. Their influence still lingers, shaping the shadows of South America to this day. The path of destruction they left behind is still being felt in the political systems, in the silent, unspoken alliances that continue to exist, in the quiet corners where whispers of their names still echo. In the next chapter, we will follow the long and painful journey of those who were eventually hunted down. Some of the Nazis would not escape the weight of their pasts, but even in their capture, their story continued, reaching out from the past, touching the lives of those who sought to bring them to justice. The reckoning, though delayed, would eventually come. But what happens when a monster, long thought to be dead, is resurrected by the hands of those who seek to punish them? The air in South America had always been thick with secrets, but as I delve deeper into the decades that followed the Nazi escape, that atmosphere becomes even heavier. The ghost of the Third Reich lingered in the corners of history, and the men who had fled Europe now found themselves in a quiet but inexorable reckoning. Some had managed to slip through the cracks, to live out their days in the relative obscurity of small towns or forgotten villages. But for others, the past had never truly let go. It had only been waiting, patient and relentless, until the time came to reclaim them. As I trace the footsteps of these men, the question that keeps echoing in my mind is, how could these individuals, these architects of unimaginable horror, live out their lives, free from the justice they so richly deserved? How did they, who had caused so much pain, manage to rebuild themselves in a land so far removed from the war they had fought to win? But even in the relative peace they sought in South America, they could never escape the truth of what they had done. The atrocities they had committed would always haunt them, lingering just beneath the surface of their carefully crafted new lives. And then, one by one, The walls that had protected them began to crumble. In the early 1960s, the world was slowly waking up to the full extent of the Nazi escape routes. The relentless pursuit of justice, fueled by the memories of the Holocaust and the survivors who would never let the world forget, began to pick up steam. People began asking questions. How had these men gotten away? How had they managed to slip through the cracks of history and disappear into South America, protected by governments and hidden by a network of supporters who had their own agendas? It was then that the most infamous of all the Nazi fugitives, Adolf Eichmann, was caught. Eichmann, the architect of the Holocaust, had managed to evade justice for over a decade, hiding under the guise of a simple businessman in Buenos Aires. He had lived quietly, blending in with the local population, his true identity hidden behind a false name. His life was one of false normalcy, a life built on the deception that he had escaped the consequences of his actions. But then, in 1960, a team of Israeli agents, working under the direction of the Mossad, tracked him down. They knew Eichmann's importance, his role in the machinery of death that had led to the destruction of millions. They knew that capturing him would be not just about justice, but about sending a message to the world. No one could escape responsibility for their actions, no matter how far they ran. I can imagine the quiet fear that must have gripped Eichmann as he was taken from his home in Buenos Aires, bound and gagged, and smuggled aboard an Israeli plane. The world that he had built in exile, his false sense of security, was ripped away in an instant. In the months that followed, Eichmann would stand trial in Israel, where his chilling testimony about the workings of the Nazi regime would send shockwaves through the world. As I look back on the image of Eichmann standing in that courtroom, I can almost hear the coldness in his voice as he spoke of the horrors he had helped orchestrate. He showed no remorse. He never once accepted responsibility for his actions. For Eichmann, it was all just a matter of duty, a job he had carried out without thought or hesitation. The trial was not just a moment of justice. It was a moment that forced the world to confront the evil that had been allowed to slip into the shadows for far too long. But Eichmann was only the beginning. The story of the Nazi escape routes was not just about one man. It was about an entire network of criminals who had sought to rebuild their lives, to escape the consequences of their actions. Eichmann's capture led to a new wave of investigations as the global community began to realize that the Nazi escape routes had been far broader than anyone had imagined. Governments in South America were suddenly under scrutiny, and the delicate alliances that had allowed these men to flourish were now being tested. In the years that followed, the hunt for the remaining Nazis grew more intense. The Israeli Mossad, now emboldened by their success with Eichmann, set their sights on other high-ranking war criminals, including the notorious Joseph Mengele, who had escaped to Brazil and lived under various aliases. Mengele's story was different. He had spent years on the run, avoiding capture, always one step ahead of his pursuers. But Mengele, too, would find that time was not on his side. His life in Brazil had been one of constant fear of discovery, of being exposed. The once powerful man, who had performed unspeakable experiments on the victims of Auschwitz, was now reduced to hiding in the shadows, constantly moving from one place to another. He had lived for years under false identities, protected by a network of sympathizers, but in the end, it was not enough. Mengele would die in 1979 in a small Brazilian town without ever being brought to justice. I think of Mengele's final years, spent in isolation, a man who had once held life and death in his hands, now reduced to a fugitive with no place to call home. The knowledge that he would never face the justice he so richly deserved must have gnawed at him, even if he never admitted it. And yet, for all his escape, Mengelé's death was a grim reminder that even the most dangerous men cannot outrun the truth forever. The stories of Eichmann and Mengele are but a small part of the larger tale of the Nazi fugitives who fled to South America. Some would eventually be caught. Others, like Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, would meet a similar fate, brought to trial for their crimes, their dark legacies finally exposed for the world to see. But for many, the story didn't end with capture. It lingered. It festered as the world continued to reckon with the scars of the past. I walk now through the streets of Buenos Aires, the city where Eichmann once lived. The noise of traffic fills the air. The scent of freshly baked bread drifts from a nearby bakery. It's a city full of life, but underneath it, I feel the echo of the past, a past that refuses to let go, a past that will always be tied to these men, to their escape, and to the reckoning that followed. In the coming years, the hunt for Nazi criminals would continue, but the story of the Nazis in South America was one that would never fully be told. The ghosts of their crimes would continue to haunt the continent, long after their deaths. The pursuit of justice, though delayed, would go on. But one question lingers, unanswered. How many others are still out there, hidden away in the forgotten corners of the world? And how many of them still believe that they can escape the weight of their past? As the decades passed, the hunt for Nazi war criminals grew more methodical, more relentless. And yet, there remained something elusive about it. Even as Eichmann's capture in the 1960s and Mengelé's eventual death in the 1970s sent shockwaves through the world, the shadowy network of Nazi fugitives in South America remained deeply entrenched, hidden behind layers of deception, corruption, and complicity. The years may have chipped away at their power, but the deep, festering legacy of their escape routes still had its grip on the continent. I walk now through the streets of Asunción, Paraguay, where the legacy of the Nazis' presence is woven into the fabric of the country's own complex history. This city, like so many others in South America, had become a haven for former Nazi officers, scientists, and sympathizers. But it wasn't just a sanctuary. It was a hub of activity, a place where the aftershocks of the war reverberated for decades. This was the place where the ghosts of the past were not only hidden, but used to shape a future built on ideology, secrecy, and power. In Paraguay, under the rule of Alfredo Stroessner, a brutal military dictatorship, the Nazis found not just refuge, but a powerful ally. Stroessner, like many of his contemporaries in Latin America, had his own ambitions. He sought to strengthen his grip on power, and the knowledge, skills, and connections the Nazis brought with them were invaluable. The Nazi officers who arrived in Paraguay weren't just men seeking to hide. They were men seeking to be useful, seeking to rebuild the foundations of an ideology that had failed, but had never truly been defeated. As I stand here, I can almost hear the muffled conversations in the darkened rooms of the military compounds, where Nazi officers and Paraguayan military leaders strategized, drawing from the same old playbooks that had shaped the rise of fascism in Europe. The expertise they brought was extraordinary. From rocket technology to military strategy, from chemical warfare to the development of advanced weaponry, the Nazis who had fled to South America had not left their knowledge behind. They had brought it with them, ready to be put to use once again. The collaboration between the Nazi fugitives and Latin American military regimes was not just about sharing knowledge. It was about cementing a vision. These men, who had once been the architects of one of the most destructive wars in history, now sought to plant the seeds of authoritarianism in a continent already scarred by violence and political instability. They found fertile ground in countries like Paraguay, where Stroessner's dictatorship was more than willing to turn a blind eye to the past in exchange for power and the tools to strengthen his rule. And yet, even as the Nazis continued to operate in the shadows, the world outside began to awaken to the depth of the deceit, to the twisted conspiracy that had allowed these war criminals to escape justice for so long. The United States, at the height of the Cold War, had its own interests in protecting some of these men. The CIA, in particular, had worked with a number of former Nazis, seeing them as valuable assets in the fight against the Soviet Union. But even as the US government found ways to benefit from the Nazis' knowledge, the echoes of their past could not be silenced. I pause as I think about the role the United States played in all of this. The alliance between the former Nazis and American intelligence was one forged in the desperate fires of the Cold War. But it wasn't just the US government that turned a blind eye. It was many others. South American regimes, governments, and military officials, blinded by their own ambitions, kept their doors open to the Nazis. They were allowed to settle, to build their power, and to remain hidden from the justice that should have been their fate. The global community, distracted by its own geopolitical struggles, had left the Nazis to their own devices, tucked away in remote corners of South America. But even as the Nazis in South America felt the illusion of safety, they were not untouchable. The question remained, when would their past catch up with them? When would the truth finally break through the thick layers of secrecy that surrounded them? The world would not remain in the dark forever. The victims of the Holocaust and their families would not let their stories fade into history. The survivors would continue to speak out, to demand justice, and to unearth the truth that so many had tried to bury. And so, in the 1980s, the pressure on the Nazi network in South America began to mount. The international community, led by the relentless pursuit of justice from countries like Israel, began to focus its attention on the fugitive Nazis who had once thought themselves untouchable. The hunt for Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, would come to symbolize the final chapter of this long, tortured saga. Barbie, who had played a key role in the murder of thousands of Jews, partisans, and resistance fighters in France, had managed to evade justice for decades. After the war, he had lived in Bolivia under the protection of the local government, building a new life. But as the 1980s dawned, the world began to demand his capture. His name had resurfaced in Europe, and the hunt for him intensified. I can almost feel the tension in the air as the hunt for Barbie grew, the whispers in the halls of power, the discussions among international agencies, the growing pressure from survivors and their families. All of it led to a single, inevitable conclusion. Klaus Barbie would be found. And in 1983, after years of evading justice, Barbie was captured in Bolivia, where he had once been shielded by those in power. His extradition to France, where he stood trial for crimes against humanity, was a moment of reckoning. It was a moment when the world finally faced the dark truth that had been hidden in the shadows of South America for so long. I stand in the quiet corners of this continent, where the ghosts of the past continue to linger. The hunt for the Nazis didn't end with Barbie's capture. The search for others would continue, and in many cases they were found, caught in the tangled web of lies and deception they had so carefully spun. The legacy of the Nazis in South America would never be fully erased. it would remain a dark stain on the history of the continent, a reminder of how easily evil can hide in plain sight and how long it can take to bring the truth to light. As I leave the shadows of South America behind, I feel the weight of this history. The story of the Nazis who escaped to this continent is not one that can easily be forgotten. It is a story of complicity, of secrecy, and of a world that failed to reckon with its darkest demons for far too long. But the truth has a way of breaking free, no matter how deep the lies run. And as the last of the Nazis are brought to justice, we are left to wonder, how many more secrets remain buried, waiting to be uncovered? As I stand at the edge of South America, looking out across the vast, untamed wilderness that stretches beyond the horizon, I am left with an unsettling sense of unfinished business. The Nazi fugitives, once thought to have escaped the retribution they so richly deserved, left behind more than just a trail of corruption and complicity. They left a shadow over the entire continent, a shadow that still lingers in places where the past is buried beneath layers of time and silence. The last chapter of their story was not just one of capture and justice, but one of a continent forever scarred by their presence. But this story isn't just about the men who escaped. It's also about the untold lives they affected, the countless families and communities that were unknowingly complicit in harboring war criminals. The story of the Nazi escape routes through South America is one that reaches deep into the heart of human nature, a chilling reminder of how easy it is for people to turn a blind eye when power, money, and ideology come into play. It is a tale of corruption, deceit, and the dangerous ways in which evil can take root when society's moral compass falters. As the final fugitives were hunted down one by one, a chilling realization began to settle over me. The escape routes weren't just a relic of the past. They were a symbol of something much darker. The Nazis, like ghosts, continued to haunt South America long after their physical presence had vanished. Their legacy of ideology, their influence over certain parts of society, lingered for decades. It is easy to think that the war criminals who fled to South America are mere ghosts, figures relegated to the past. But in truth, their escape was only the beginning of a new, insidious chapter that continued to affect the political landscape of the continent for years. I think back to the people who played a role in hiding these criminals, governments, military regimes, and individuals who allowed these fugitives to thrive in secrecy. Were they simply doing it for power? Or did they believe that the old ideologies still had something to offer? The disturbing truth is that the allure of fascism, authoritarianism, and the remnants of Nazi ideology never completely disappeared in South America. These beliefs, twisted as they were, continued to find fertile ground in places that were already teeming with political instability, poverty, and corruption. And so, even as the Nazis were brought to trial and their legacies were slowly dismantled, their influence, faint but undeniable, remained. For some, the post-war years were a time of rebuilding, of forging new futures. But for others, it was a time of quietly continuing the mission that had been interrupted by their failure in Europe. They hadn't just fled. They had made South America a launching point for something more dangerous, something insidious that would last long into the 20th century. The capture of the last of the Nazi fugitives didn't mark the end of this story. The people who had lived in the shadows, hiding their pasts, were only one part of a much larger tapestry. The dark undercurrents of fascism, authoritarianism, and extremism would remain, always waiting for the right conditions to resurface. The power that these men had once wielded, the influence they had built in their exile, did not vanish with their deaths. It continued to ripple through South American society. As I take one last look at the landscape of this continent, so lush, so filled with life, I can't help but feel the echoes of the past still lingering, wrapped in the air like a dense fog. The Nazis may have been hunted, captured, and brought to justice, but the scars they left, both in South America and in the world, are permanent. Their escape routes through the jungles, across borders, and into the heart of a continent's political machine will never be forgotten. They remain a chilling reminder of how history can be twisted, how easily evil can be hidden, and how long it can take for justice to reach even the farthest corners of the world. But there's something else that stands out, a message that resonates even through the layers of darkness. The pursuit of justice is never truly over. The escape of the Nazis may have seemed like a momentary victory for them, but it was always clear that their past could never be erased. The past, as the survivors of the Holocaust have shown us time and again, is something that can never be forgotten, no matter how far it stretches, no matter how deeply it is buried. I turn away from the distant horizon, knowing that this story, though it has spanned continents and decades, is not just a tale of the past. It is a story that continues to unfold in the present, as the world grapples with the legacies of those who tried to rewrite history, who sought to escape responsibility, and who tried to rebuild their lives on the rubble of so many others. The question, though, remains: how many other secrets, how many other dark histories are buried beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered? And what does it mean when those who have escaped justice for so long finally face the consequences of their actions? The shadow of the Nazis in South America may have faded, but the lessons it offers about complicity, about power, about the nature of evil will continue to shape the world for generations to come. I leave you with one final thought. The Nazis may have escaped justice for a time, but history, in the end, has a way of catching up with even the most elusive criminals. The truth will always find its way to the surface. It's only a matter of when.